It's been called the worst man-made disaster since World War II. 7 years on from the start of the Syrian civil war, is there any hope for a solution and an end to the violence? That's our debate. Syria has been described as one of the worst humanitarian crises of our time. More than 5 million people have fled the country, hundreds of thousands have lost their lives, and yet the war continues. Syrian civilians have been under fire in areas like Idlib and eastern Ghouta, and even though some say Bashar al-Assad and his allies seem to have defeated the rebels, there is no clear political solution in sight. So what has to happen to bring the fighting and suffering to an end? Joining me in the arena to debate this are Karlin, Senior Fellow at Brookings and a former top Pentagon official under President Obama, Alexey Khlebnikov, a Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council in Moscow, and from Ankara, Syrian journalist and activist Rami Jarrah. Thank you all for joining me on UpFront. Rami, let me start with you. It's been more than 7 years since the Arab Spring failed in Syria, war broke out. But given that Bashar al-Assad, with Russian and Iranian support, seems to have regained control of the majority of his country, is it coming to a close? Has the Syrian regime won?
I think to answer that, we'd have to focus on the fact that if we were saying that winning the game was meeting the aspirations of the people of Syria, then that wouldn't be the case. But if we're talking about this political game and gaining that stronghold in Syria and maintaining power for the near future, then that's definitely the case.
Alexey Khlebnikov, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced from their homes. Is this really a victory for Assad, or should I say for Assad and Putin?
Well, so if we all agree that Russia's major goal was to back up existing Syrian institutions and regime, to significantly eliminate capability of terrorists in Syria, then of course that was a successful and is successful story. But if we look at this as a political solution, that the ultimate goal is the political solution, then of course the conflict is really far from over. And I think this year is going to be quite challenging for all parties involved, internally and external as well.
Mara, you said at a recent US congressional hearing that, quote, Assad won his war to stay in power. A lot of people would say that's because of the United States and its refusal to get more involved in getting rid of him. Is that fair or not?
I think the United States played a role. The international community more broadly played a role. The timing of the conflict in the throes of other conflicts erupting and uprisings across the region, no doubt, also did too. And frankly, those inside Syria have their own agency. You know, this idea, though, of what Assad wins is a pretty interesting one to think about. He's no doubt won a long-term insurgency, even as he tries to take more and more control of Syrian territory. He's also won some sort of interesting dynamics with the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah. What do they see as their long-term goal in Syria? What do they plan to do? What sort of weapon systems do they want to keep in Syria? What sort of military presence? What sort of activities do they want to launch from Syria? So his winning is not an entirely positive affair, even in his eyes, I suspect.
But you worked in the Pentagon during the Obama era. Would you call Syria his biggest failure, President Obama's biggest failure?
I think on the foreign policy front, absolutely.
Rami, how did we get to this stage? When you allocate responsibility or blame for the position Syria finds itself in today, Assad still in power, violence still continuing, rebel groups still divided, where do you place the blame? Is there a hierarchy of blame that you have in your head?
In Syria now, what you have is a segment of society that has been banished from society, and it is one that refuses not to have a voice in Syria. And it's been labeled as being a fundamentalist group that is not accepted in society or is considered in any form of it refusing to accept the standards in this country means that that they're terrorists. So I think that the main problem that we have in Syria is the labels that have been granted to everyone, and those labels being accepted on an international level. If you look at existing parties in Europe that now support Assad, that openly saying that they support a dictator, whereas if any one individual across Europe said that they supported Hitler, they could face trial. Whereas now it's okay to say that you support a dictator that has killed 500,000
So Rami,
people
what would you say
and has driven half of the country out of
UN
half of the population
Lakhdar
out of the country?
Brahimi,
That's fine.
who said on this show in March 2016 that there were, quote, no good guys in the Syrian tragedy, i.e. pointing out, yes, Assad's a monster, but there have been some pretty serious mini-monsters faced up against him.
I would say that it took a very long time until there was an actual, I don't think we actually even saw an intervention at any stage. There was no serious approach to solving the problem in Syria. I think that there were many interests of the countries involved that were standing on the sideline and watching to seeing what was going to happen, and maybe hoping that there would be turmoil in the Middle East. And they let this problem go on for way too long. This is the reason that we're where we are.
Alexey, isn't that the reality? Yes, there may be quote-unquote terrorists amongst the opposition, but there are an awful lot of innocent people who just want their freedom from Assad. That hasn't changed over 7 years. And yet your country's Air Force has joined Assad's Air Force in bombing and killing those people, a lot of whom just want freedom.
Well, firstly, there are no saints in any war. That's the first thing. Secondly, yes, Russia joined not Assad as an individual, but Russia supports the existing institutions and state structures. And primarily it's the armed forces who are able to fight on the ground against terrorists. Secondly, yes, Russian air forces are participating in this campaign against terrorists, which is called mainly they're taking ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra targets. But yes, there are some claims which are not factually proven that Russian jets were like part of the offense of Eastern Ghouta, which is not the case, for example.
But Alexey, you know there's a long list of human rights groups, including UN officials, who say Russian aircraft have used unguided bombs, including blast weapons, in densely populated civilian areas and may have committed war crimes in those civilian areas. You know that. There's plenty of reports documenting that.
Yes, of course, I've heard about those reports, yes. And I mean, as I already mentioned, there are no saints in any war, and especially in the civil war. When there is a bombing campaign, we've heard lots of times when terrorists use civilians as civilian shields and use hospitals and universities and schools packed with kids as human shields. So yes, this is of course the case, and this tragedies happens in Syria for the last years.
Mara, when we look at the sum total of violence in Syria right now, the United States, isn't a problem for the United States that you rightly accuse Russia of killing civilians in Syria? That's well documented. But the US has been doing its own bombing campaign in Syria and in Iraq, in which hundreds of coalition airstrikes have killed, according to one air war study, more civilians than Russian airstrikes did at the beginning of last year in the first 3 months of 2017.
Look, there's no equivalency whatsoever. The Russian regime works hand in hand with Assad and his regime, and that has been clearly illustrated, and it preceded ISIS, no doubt. What you are seeing, at least at the American side, fighting, it is trying to fight against groups like ISIS. It is trying to support civilians as much as possible. Absolutely.
But killing a lot of civilians, at one stage more than the Russians between January and April last year.
Civilian casualties have absolutely occurred on the U.S. side, and they have been a tragedy. They are regularly investigated by the U.S. military. There's then a questioning of procedures, rules of engagement, and what needs to change. It seems as though, when you look at how the Russian military has operated in Syria, that actually civilian casualties may be part and parcel of its strategy.
I don't think so. Simply because it's not in Russia's interest, because it's absolutely not true that it's civilian casualties, collateral damage is a part of Russia's strategy in Syria.
Well, then Russia's military is just pretty incompetent. I mean, it's been pretty clear Russia's military has tried to use Syria as its tactical and operational battleground to test its weapons, to give its military personnel a bit of practice.
That's not the initial reason for going in Syria. Of course, it's during the campaign you test the weapon as well. You test your arms systems on the ground in a real combat.
Okay.
Yes, of course, but it's not the reason. It's not the driver of Russia's involvement in Syria. It's absolutely not true what you're saying.
Russia's involvement in Syria since it intervened. I mean, I'm one of the people that was in Aleppo, and I documented the Russian airstrikes. We watched closely. I think there was a group called Bellingcat that had actually found pictures that were released by the military and by the foreign ministry, Russian foreign ministry, that said that they had targeted ISIS. And they were in these images, and those images were actually residential homes in central Aleppo where there were no signs of ISIS, and this happened a number of times. So Russia, the thing is that Russia plays this bigger brother role, where if anything goes wrong, then it can say that, you know, this is Assad doing this. They know the amount of civilians that are being killed. They have this data. I think they have more data than the Syrians themselves do. So they know exactly what Assad is doing, and they share a responsibility in the crimes that are being committed.
Mara, isn't it the case President Obama was considering ISIL as the bigger threat, and therefore that was one of the main reasons he didn't go all in, as some of his advisors wanted to, in terms of no-fly zones or greater weaponry to the rebels than they were already sending, etc.?
I think ISIL shifted the conversation at that moment in time. I don't think it was because of ISIL that he did not go all in. That decision had already occurred in some ways. But instead it was ISIL is the near-term, no-kidding serious problem. We are still profoundly concerned about what is going on with the Assad regime. So it was not mutually exclusive per se, but in terms of prioritization, ISIL had to be that one.
Let me put that same question to Rami. Do you think if ISIL hadn't appeared on the scene a few years ago, more would have been done as you would have liked to be done by outside powers, Western powers, against Assad and the Syrian government?
I think that would have been a game changer, yes, because the truth is, for Syrians, ISIS, I'm not going to say that ISIS became an option, but then ISIS made it easier for other groups, moderate Islamist groups, we would call them, that were committing crimes against Syrian civilians as well, such as Jabhat al-Nusra, Jaish al-Mujahideen. These groups are committing crimes against those that opposed Assad and those that supported Assad. So they became an easier option for people who had to choose between Assad and something else, because ISIS was there. I think that ISIS's presence, as I said earlier, was if it has caused any damage, it has caused damage to the Syrian opposition more than anyone. So if it hadn't come into the picture, then we would be in a different situation today, definitely.
Alexey, what do you think the Russian/Syrian government plan is for the non-ISIS, non-Jabhat al-Nusra, non-Al-Qaeda forces in Syria? Do you actually think that's even possible? For the Syrian government in the long term to reconcile with legitimate, non-quote-unquote jihadist opposition groups?
As you can see, Russia, since its military involvement, simultaneously started to launch this reconciliation process within Syria. Secondly, we witnessed this launch of new negotiation track in Astana, which was not an alternative to Geneva, as many argue, but the additional track which was aimed at settling down more nuanced things on the ground, which made it happen when real field commanders from the ground who have actual influence were able to meet and sit together and talk. So I wouldn't put all blame for Syria's destruction on Russia. I think all parties involved have responsibility.
Okay, Alexey, you made the point. Okay, let me put the point about America to Mara. What do you think Trump's endgame is? We know we've talked about Obama's failure in Syria. What do you think Trump's endgame is?
You know, that's the million-dollar question, Mehdi. At a minimum, I do think the Trump administration's priority has been to deal with ISIL. And they have continued the Obama administration strategy and are successfully doing so. The challenge will be what's next. Right now, the U.S. military has 2,000 personnel in Syria. So going forward, what's the purpose in having those 2,000 U.S. military personnel? What's actually their mandate, their mission, their rules of engagement? My view is, at a minimum, it should just be clear. we should not delude ourselves into thinking that they are not combatants in whatever's going on. And I think the U.S. really needs to prioritize humanitarian assistance, particularly for the refugees now who have really streamed across the region in a number of states that aren't terribly strong to begin with.
Yeah, and you have a US president who demonizes them all as terrorists and snakes, etc. Rami, let me ask you this. What is your message to the US government today, to other Western governments? What would you want them to do? If you could wave a magic wand and get them to do what you wanted to do, what would it be?
A magic wand. The thing is, I don't want to be offensive, but I think that whatever I'm going to say is not really going to matter in that sense. But I think that what's important now for a Syrian population is not just looking at the situation of Syrians that are inside Syria, because a very large segment of Syrian society is no longer in Syria. And I think what we need now is integration programs for Syrians abroad. Because I think that's where the opposition is headed. It's headed abroad, where now a Syrian diaspora is being built outside the country. Because the situation in Syria is not open arms to Syrians coming back. It's open arms to Syrians that are willing to keep their mouths shut and accept the fact that half of the country has been driven out and 500,000 people have been killed and society has been raped of all of its rights. So I think that if they want to fix this situation at this stage, it's to provide Syrians that have actually left the country and those that wish to leave the country a situation where they can actually live in dignity and enjoy the freedoms that everyone else would enjoy.
We'll have to leave it there. Mara, Rami, Alexey, thank you all for joining me in the arena here on UpFront.
Thank you.
Johann Hari is a best-selling British author who spent the last 3 years working on a new book about what he believes the real causes of anxiety and depression are. Hari says we've been looking at depression all wrong. It's not the widely prescribed antidepressants we should be focused on, but our society and our culture. A self-proclaimed child of the Prozac age, Hari says we need to spend more time in nature, enjoying our work, building lasting relationships. These unexpected solutions will help solve anxiety and depression. But just how unexpected are they? And how realistic are they? Johann Hari joins me now. Thanks for coming on UpFront.
Great to be with you.
In your new book, Lost Connections, you do a deep dive into anxiety and depression. What made you want to even begin researching and writing a book on this subject to begin with?
Yeah, it was a bit before that. I'd gone to my doctor when I was a teenager and I'd explained that I had this feeling like pain was kind of bleeding out of me and I couldn't regulate it or control it. I felt quite ashamed of it. And my doctor told me, I'll give you these drugs, it'll boost you. And I felt a tremendous amount of relief, like most people who take the drugs at first. Then the feeling of pain started to kind of bleed back through, so I was given higher and higher doses until I was taking the maximum possible dose for 13 years. At the end of it, I still felt terrible, and I thought, well, what's happening here? Because I'm doing everything our culture tells me to do. But the more important mystery to me is, why were there so many other people in our culture who are so deeply distressed? You know, 1 in 5 Americans will take a psychiatric drug in their lifetime. There are far more people who are really deeply anxious and depressed who are not doing this. So I ended up going on this big journey, meeting scientists all over the world, the leading experts on what causes depression and anxiety and how to solve them. And I learned the World Health Organization, the leading medical body in the world, their position is that the chemical imbalance theory is way too simplistic, that actually, as they put it, mental health is produced socially and it needs social as well as individual solutions.
But if the WHO is saying that and you call the consensus over the chemical imbalance deeply misleading and unscientific.
There isn't a consensus around the medical imbalance. Yeah, so there is no consensus.
So there is no consensus. If the WHO is saying that, then what's the problem? Is it not filtered down to grassroots levels, to local doctors, or what?
So there's this weird. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. There's this weird disconnection because nobody denies that there are social and psychological causes of depression and anxiety, but that has not informed most of how we respond to these problems. So I'll give you an example. I noticed that lots of the people I know who are depressed and anxious, their depression and anxiety focuses around their work. So I start to look at what's the evidence about how people feel about their work. And the figures are quite shocking. They come from Gallup, the most detailed study we have. 13% of people in our culture like their work most of the time. 63% of what they called sleep working, so they don't like it, they don't hate it. 24% of people hate their work. That means 87% of people don't like the thing they're doing most of their waking lives. if you go to work and you feel controlled, you have low or no control, you are much more likely to become depressed. You're also much more likely to have a stress-related heart attack.
You say our culture, but there are many, many non-Western cultures that have always taken, valuing other things other than material goals, focusing on community. So it's not necessarily innovative or new for everyone around the world who might say, you're telling us what we already know and do.
Yeah, I think that's a fair enough point. I think as a culture, Western culture, which has become the dominant culture across the world and is obviously being imposed on a lot of the world, it has disconnected many people from their deeper underlying psychological needs being met. This is one reason there's all this interesting research that actually mental health massively increases when people move from developing countries to developed countries, right? So if you live in Bangladesh and you move to the United States, your risks of mental health problems go up absolutely enormously. Now, part of that is the pressure of racism and those things which are very real. But I think a big part of that is moving from a society where deeper psychological needs are met to societies where our psychological needs are met much less effectively.
And you talk about interviewing a lot of experts and doctors and scientists. You're not an expert or scientist or doctor yourself.
No, I'm of course a journalist. I'm not a scientist, yeah.
So you're not telling people to stop taking antidepressants?
Yeah,
you're not qualified to say that?
Well, it's bizarre that loads of people have acted like that's what I've said when I've unequivocally said in the book.
Dean Burnett, who's a neuroscientist at Cardiff University in the UK, he says you're asserting yourself as a, quote, maverick expert and backing up your arguments with suspect cherry-picking of evidence. He says because of your past reputation, you were accused, I think you admitted to plagiarizing in the past, that people like yourself with that reputation shouldn't make, quote, sweeping statements about something as sensitive as mental health. What do you say to him?
What's curious is Dean Burnett himself wrote an article less than a year ago making exactly the same point I make, which is that quoting approvingly a study which shows that more than half of people who take chemical antidepressants don't experience a significant relief in their depression. So it would be completely right to be critical if I was coming along with some maverick position that was outside the scientific consensus. What I'm trying to do is explain the position of the World Health Organization and the leading scientists in the world.
It's a contradiction, Johann, because you come along and it's a best-selling book. It's got lots of interesting people reviewing it on the back. But then when I'm asking you about it, you're saying, well, I'm not telling you anything new. But then why write a book about it?
But it's a really weird disconnect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, this has been known by scientists for years, and yet I don't know anyone who went to their doctor and got told this stuff. So I think the book is trying to come in the middle of this weird disconnect, where actually scientists know this stuff perfectly well, right? This is not particularly controversial, and yet, firstly, it's not been explained to the public, but I think more importantly...
You're saying on the medical front line, that's where the message is being lost, when you go to your local doctor?
I think it's more that it's just not been explained to the wider culture.
So another critic of yours, Carmine Pariente, a psychiatrist, professor at King's College London, says contrary to the claim that too many people are prescribed antidepressants, he points out that only 1 in 5 people with depression in high-income countries receive help, psychological or pharmacological. In the developing world, it's even less. Only 1 in 27 people who need it get help. So are you looking at this problem the wrong way around?
Yeah, I think Dr. Pariente is absolutely right. People urgently need help with depression and anxiety. One of the people who really helped me to understand this is a wonderful South African psychiatrist I got to know called Dr. Derek Summerfield. So Dr. Summerfield happened to be in Cambodia when chemical antidepressants were first introduced. And the doctors there didn't know what these drugs were, obviously, so he explained to them. And they said, oh, we don't need them, we've already got antidepressants. And he said, what do you mean? They told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields who one day stood on a landmine left over by the American invasion of Southeast Asia, had his leg blown off, they gave him an artificial limb, he went back to work in the fields. But apparently it's super painful to work underwater with an artificial limb. I imagine it was quite traumatic to be in a field where you've been blown up. He starts to cry all day, doesn't want to get out of bed. Classic depression and anxiety. They said to Derek, we gave him an antidepressant. He said, what did you do? They explained they went and sat with him. They listened to his problem. They understood, again, his pain made sense, wasn't some irrational malfunction. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could, he would get out of this situation where he was so depressed. He'd become a dairy farmer. They bought him a cow, and within a few weeks, he stopped crying all the time. As they said to him, so you see, doctor, that cow was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the World Health Organization has been trying, and all these other scientists have been trying to tell us for years, which is, if you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not crazy. Your pain is not a malfunction. It's not a pathology. You're not a machine with broken parts.
But on the specific point of antidepressants, is it your view that they're overprescribed right now? Because it's not Pariente's view. So I'm just wondering, is that your view?
Sure. No, not particularly. I mean, I think there are plenty of people who were like me, who were taking chemical antidepressants and they didn't help. And for those people, if they want to, I'd recommend they cut back very slowly. There are other people who would be helped by antidepressants who aren't taking them. This isn't an argument for or against chemical antidepressants. It's an argument for expanding what we think of as an antidepressant. It's dealing with the reasons why people are depressed and anxious in the first place.
So you have 300 million people worldwide living with depression or anxiety. You sound optimistic. How optimistic are you? What hope is there for 300 million people?
I think part of the cruelest thing we've done is we've put the onus for solving this problem onto depressed and anxious people. We don't do that with other problems. We don't say the problem of car crashes have to be solved by people who've already been mangled in a car accident, right? We have seatbelts and speed limits and airbags, and we arrest DUIs, right? In a similar way, what we need, because this is a social crisis primarily, not entirely, there are real biological factors, but because this is primarily a social crisis, we need social solutions, not least because the factors that are making some people acutely depressed and anxious are making most people in this culture less happy than they could be. I think you'd struggle to find a person who could read the 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in the book and not identify with at least one of them playing out in their life. Now, most people don't become acutely depressed, thankfully, but these changes are changes that will radically improve people's lives more generally.
Even if you don't suffer from depression and anxiety, you're talking about general well-being and happiness.
Exactly, and you think about what it's like to be in a culture where people are increasingly isolated, they are alone, they are broken up, they're told that money is about that life is about spending, it's about buying and accumulating. They're encouraged to spend their lives screaming at each other through screens and being controlled at work. And then we tell them that the pain of all that is just the result of a chemical imbalance in their brains. Are we surprised that depression and anxiety keep rising in those situations? It doesn't have to be this way.
Johann Hari, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for coming on UpFront. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.